What you're hearing there is the sound of the onslaught that's making Britain smaller. Yep, on today's Sky News ClimateCast, we're talking about coastal erosion. I'm on the south side of the Isle of Wight. Many tens of miles in front of me, across the waves, would be France. And over to my right, I can see the iconic white chalk cliffs. Immediately behind me are cliffs that are tumbling into the sea. I can see big rocks that have fallen down, bits of the topsoil earth that's still green that's now on the beach, so that's clearly fallen down very recently. It's a wet day that makes the soggy cliffs even heavier, even more mobile, which means they're likely to fall down. But across the country, we're seeing many communities at risk from coastal erosion, and we're asking what on earth we can do about it. I've just met Kate, who's walking a lovely little dog along here. Who's this you've got there?
This is Conker. She's a Cocker Spaniel.
Okay. And you're walking along the cliff edge here. What have you noticed recently?
It's eroding at an accelerating rate. I grew up here and I've watched it my whole life. It seems to be worse in the last few years.
And what do you think about that?
It'll be an absolute travesty to lose this road. The military road is in danger, and that, as a local, is something I'm very concerned about. I think it's got 3 danger zones now that the council have looked into options of how to save.
And for people who don't live here, can you explain why people are so attached to the road? Why does it matter so much?
It's one of the most beautiful views in the whole of the south coast to cruise down this road on a clear sunny day. It's a fast link between Freshwater and Ventnor. I think it's one of the critical parts of the island to stay connected to, really. It's the access to our more Jurassic beaches. This side of the island is very underdeveloped, which is beautiful.
It's not just roads at risk. Some people living on the Isle of Wight have had no choice but to build their own defences to future-proof their properties. Rob Sovan is one of them. He designed his own house to be flood resilient and built barriers to keep out the sea itself.
There's an inner seawall, so the waves are designed to come over, crash in here, fill this up like a pool, and then drain back out to sea on those drain holes. This is all designed to be flooded. And even the planting, so we've got sea kale, sea poppies, they're all happy being flooded, and we still keep a garden.
And you've built and paid for this all yourself?
So some of this seawall's been here 50 years long before me, but largely, yes, there was very little here.
So is it possible to go down and have a look at it?
Yeah, please do. And what you can see is this wall's got probably 4 or 5 generations of protection. The oldest part here is probably 50, 60 years old. And then people have added bits to it. And then the last bit I've added to it is this, actually very new, it's only 6 months old. And so what happens over time is you just add more and more to it.
So you put this extra concrete defence in yourself, or
Yes.
you paid for it to happen?
Yes.
Roughly how much does something like this cost?
So this section was about 4,500. I've been here 20 years, and I probably, in reality, spend about £500 a year.
And you're not on your own here. I can see others have done that, particularly behind us. I can see those rocks in cages over there. That looks quite new.
Someone's working on something all the time.
Yeah.
We also have breakwaters, so those keep the beach level high, and that reduces the wave action.
So you put in these little groins here yourself?
Well,
these bits of
I
rock?
maintain them.
Right.
So they're there. A big storm comes and they get moved, so you still have to put them back every so often.
It's worth just describing where Rob and I are standing. We've got the sea about 4 metres on our right. Immediately on our left is this seawall that Rob's talking about he's built in the last 6 months. It's about 2 metres high, perhaps a little bit less, say 30 or 40 centimetres thick, and it is solid concrete with a few pipes coming out, I guess, to drain the bit of land inside. And the breakwaters he's talking about are these things which geographers like me call groins, which run down the beach, run at 90 degrees to the coast itself. And the idea of those is that they stop all the sand and shingle being moved along the beach. And that matters here because if you lowered the beach, it would undermine the newly built defences that Rob's just put in. And a bit further up, his neighbours have put in a different kind of sea defence. These are cages of solid rock about 1 metre long, half a metre high, and they're all along the front of their property. Yeah, you can see what people are putting their money into here to keep the sea out.
On the Isle of Wight, landslides are becoming a daily occurrence. A recent one in Ventnor is thought to be the largest in Europe. And it's not just due to sea level rise. Water from above is causing a problem too. Many parts of Britain have had an exceptionally wet winter, in tune with climate predictions, and this makes some cliffs waterlogged and slippery.
Just at the beginning of the show there, I mentioned the cliffs that are falling down. Some of these rocks that are here in front of me have just fallen off this very active cliff. By active, I mean in danger of falling, well, not exactly on my head because it's not quite as sheer as that, but definitely falling around my feet. There are rocks here, I mean, we're talking many tons here, and just above me is the eroded edge of a car park. This is part of the UK which is definitely disappearing into the surrounding waves.
We know with sea level rise and climate change and bigger storms, the coast is washing away far faster than it ever has before.
Angela Terry is an environmental scientist who's researched what's at risk from erosion and how we work out what to save.
Erosion's always happened, but what we're seeing now is it's accelerating. The maps we're using are still outdated. They don't have climate projections in it, so we're simply not ready for how much land is falling into the sea every year.
Well, when it comes to coastline, what's kind of marked for protection and what's not?
In England already, over a third is down as no active intervention, or as we would call it, just abandon. So no defences at all. And for the rest, there's no budget allocated to those protections. So it gives people a false sense of hope, actually, that they will be protected in their homes.
As you say, a lot of our coastline is at danger of falling into the sea. Presumably we can't defend it all, or could we?
Yeah, it's absolutely impossible to build a seawall around the whole of the coast. We've got the largest coastline in Europe, and it's constantly evolving. So both financially and physically, we can't build a wall around the whole of the sea. So this is where this debate about which communities will be saved and which ones literally, when the cliffs crumble, they will be gone.
And
basically.
how's that calculation being made at the moment?
So at the moment, that is a project led by the Environment Agency. They're called shoreline management plans, and they have all been consulted on, but hardly anyone knows they exist. So people are still putting extensions onto their homes that literally won't be there in 10 or 20 years' time.
So how's the decision made now about what to protect and what to give to the waves?
The first one is environmental. Is it sound structural engineering to do it? And the second is around money.
Right.
So basically, if an area is very poor and not worth much, then how can they justify spending all that money to defend those homes?
I kind of get this in a way, because you might say, well, we should protect what's vulnerable. That's why we've got, the Thames barrier protecting London. But are there sort of social injustice elements here?
Absolutely. So we're seeing some of the most poorest people losing their homes, losing everything because their communities aren't going to be protected.
So to spell this out, we could end up with basically the wealthier areas being protected and the poor areas going into the sea.
Yeah, and that's already starting to happen because those defences need partnership money as well, so they need people to contribute as well, and obviously you have to have money to be able to help put seawalls up around your house.
What do you think about that?
Climate change is the most unjust thing in the world anyway, and this is just the sharpest example of it. People losing their homes and having nowhere else to go. They've lost everything, and there's no compensation for them.
Would there be a better way of doing it in your view? Because as you say, we don't have an unlimited bank balance, and there's something a bit Canute-like about trying to hold back the sea.
Yeah, families who are losing their homes, they are climate refugees. They need compensation, and the sea defences need to be funded. And obviously, when we look at the cause of climate change and the profits of the oil and gas companies, it's really obvious how we could fund some of this work and compensation that needs to happen.
It's interesting you make that link. So if it were up to you, there'd be a kind of some of the money, the tax that comes from the fossil fuels should be put into defending coasts.
Absolutely, and rolling back the communities who are going to face losing everything.
Right, so actually pay for them to move, pay for a new house.
Yes, absolutely.
It seems to me there might be a happy middle from, we can't defend everything, we know that, but you could defend more if you wanted to spend more, couldn't you?
Currently, what we're due to defend hasn't got the money allocated to it. And the public conversation about what we're going to lose just isn't happening yet. And the reasons behind it, which is increasing climate change.
The idea of residents getting together to coordinate and pay for measures to protect their homes is all very well if you have the money to do it. But does Rob Sovan think other coastal communities around Britain could or should be following suit?
I chose to build that house. I don't see why someone else should pay for me to protect it. So I'm in a situation where I think I should pay for it. And quite frankly, I can afford to. I think there's other communities that have been put into affordable housing in low-lying areas where the state should absolutely help and protect. And there's infrastructure that needs protecting. But here we're lucky. Here, everyone here chose to be here. And if you like, the price of maintaining the seawall and the defences is the price I pay for the joy of living by the sea.
It's also worth saying that Rob's house is not perched on a rapidly disappearing cliff, but rather on the edge of a bay where erosion is more manageable. And as storms become more extreme and sea levels continue to rise, the British Geological Survey suggests, in their more extreme scenario, without further sea defences, that as many as 1.35 million homes around the UK could be at risk by the end of the century. In a moment, the ClimateCast team travel nearly 250 miles to North Norfolk, where more than 800 homes along a 10-mile stretch of coastline are expected to be lost in the same time frame.
Coastal erosion in the UK is very far from a problem that's confined to the Isle of Wight or even to the south coast of Britain. Much of the south and east, all the way up to the sort of Humber estuary, is particularly vulnerable to disappearing into the sea. This is for two reasons. One, climate change, as we talked about before, is making the sea level higher, but also the whole of the UK is slightly tipping down, with the northwest of sort of Scotland coming out of the water a little bit and the south and east of the country dipping in. It's all to do with a rebound after glaciation, after some of the ice melted, and it melted later in Scotland. So, as I've just hinted, East Anglia particularly vulnerable to coastal erosion, and so we wanted to go up there as well, and we did. Producer Gemma Watson was there. Gemma, you were out in North Norfolk, seeing a lot of places, talking to a lot of people. What did you encounter?
First of all, I went to Hemsby. It's a seaside small town, and it is at the forefront of coastal erosion. At the end of last year, a road collapsed and people's homes were actually destroyed because they'd got so close to the front line, to the sea. When I got there was a group of people who I met, and they're all part of the Save Hemsby coastline. They were so pleased to be speaking to the media.
Well, we'll hear from them in a moment. But did you get the sense they sort of felt forgotten? They're kind of dropping off the edge of the country and nobody cares. Was that their overall manner?
That is their main frustration, their main anger. And that's why I was speaking to someone who, even though he had lost his home, even though it was too late for him, he really felt strongly that he needed to be there, because that was exactly what happened. He got a knock on the door, he lost his home, and since then he's just been put in a flat elsewhere and no help, nothing.
Just before we hear from him, what's the actual process?
Kevin Jordan got a knock on the door and was told, you have a week to collect all your belongings and leave and find alternative accommodation.
This is completely unrecognisable now. I lived there for 14 years. I was aware that this is a fast eroding coastline around Norfolk, but I'd had a life of working in the marine environment, and I knew a lot of colleagues who were hydrographers and marine surveyors, and I asked them prior to buying my place what they thought of how long it had. And they all looked at the data and took a while, and they finally all came back to me and said I got between 80 and 100 years there. So I thought that would do me for retirement. Our storm season here on the coast of the North Sea, usually sort of December, late December through to March. And that's the stormy season when you can expect the worst of the weather. We started getting storms, one in July, one in August that was really severe damage. That's unprecedented. Never heard of that sort of weather before. I thought our days were numbered where we were, but I hadn't got a clue of what I could do because I put everything into my retirement home. That was my asset. I had nowhere else to go. I've got no family here. I couldn't move. The stress was pretty unbearable, actually, not knowing what you can do about something. I had a knock on the door on the evening just after the storm, the day later, and it was someone from Yarmouth Borough Council Building Control and handed me a letter saying, I've got 7 days to get out. I had no road, it had just been washed away. So I didn't quite know what I was supposed to do. I would be homeless. I was classified as vulnerable and that they would rehome me. But that's just a 1-bedroom ground floor flat in the middle of a village, some distance from here. Not the lovely little sea view property that I retired to. The government don't pay compensation for people whose homes have been demolished through erosion. I got zero. I got nothing. It's all gone.
This is something that does slightly perplex me, is that some people say, well, hang on a minute, how come these folks didn't know? I mean, coastal erosion has been, actually, it's been with us for hundreds of years. Yes, it's accelerated due to climate change, but there are lost villages in the North Sea that are sort of famous in history. Is that really it, that you think people did know about this thing, but they've just been blindsided by the speed of the disappearance of the coast?
That's exactly it. I met another gentleman. He's moved from Northampton with his wife. They lost 8 metres in a week of coastline. They are the figures we're talking about. We're not talking about a metre a year, which is what some people have said to me.
Can you give me a feeling of roughly how many homes we're talking about in perhaps in Hemsby and in some of the neighbouring villages?
We're talking about hundreds of homes, and it's happening all the time. The group took me to another area. It was a sand dune and it was sort of fenced off. There was another home with a light at the bottom of the garden, and we could see that looking up from the beach. And apparently the woman who lives there, when that light goes, she knows she needs to get out of her home. But that's the measures that these people are now taking.
Her warning light is the light vanishing, in fact.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just Hemsby. There's another village further up the coast, Haysborough. It's a really old village. It's got this amazing lighthouse, a 16th century pub, and there's a lady there, Bryony. When I spoke to her, she was on the verge of tears, telling me that she didn't know where she was going to live. It was probably going to be in a motorhome.
In the middle of the night when I get up to go to the loo and look out of the window and I think I'm not going to have this much longer. I'm not going to have the comfort of carpets under my feet and central heating. It's quite depressing, actually. I mean, seriously depressing.
Well, you can feel the raw emotion in her voice. Who are people blaming for this?
Well, funnily enough, this is a question that you put to me. Do they blame the people that are causing climate change, that are causing the sea level rises? And actually, they don't. Their anger is far more immediate there, and it lays right at the door of their local politicians, their council, their MPs.
It's really interesting. It's probably a wider philosophical question. You know, the acceleration, you said, we've kind of agreed is due largely to climate change, driven by, big companies and all of us still using fossil fuels, and yet the anger tends to go towards the government, is basically what you're saying. Which I find intriguing, although I'm not saying it's wrong, because, we do make decisions over what we choose to protect and what we don't. And there is a sort of formula in the UK that protects what's valuable, i.e. the more of the economy that would be lost if this disappeared into the sea, it's more likely to get protected. That can actually have strange consequences, because it means more valuable homes, therefore owned by richer people, tend to end up being better protected than less valuable homes owned by poorer people, which has interesting sort of social justice questions about it. But as you say, they do point the finger at the government, and their local MP is a Conservative MP, and his name is Duncan Baker, and I managed to catch up with him by Zoom.
We've got to remember, this isn't just about coastal erosion and the sea battering the cliffs, rising sea levels, all of the problems we have there. It's also about groundwater. And the amount of rain we've had since October has meant the ground is saturated. And that is very, very difficult to control when, of course, we see slippages happening all the time. It's the sort of perfect storm, so to speak, of causing this problem. We have been lucky. There's been money, about £20 million allocated along our coast for some of the higher volumes of settlements around Cromer and Munsley, about £20 million of coastal sea defences that are being put in there. The problem where this comes is about taxpayers' money. and the kind of metrics that are applied to when you spend that money. And of course, also research goes to show that sometimes coastal sea defences, which we used to see back in the sort of 40s and 50s, all these wooden revetments and structures aren't always as good at doing the job as perhaps you'd like to think. That's why we've had this sandscaping scheme where millions of pounds has been invested, mainly from the Dutch, to protect a critical supply of a third of the UK's gas coming into that area. So I want to see more private investment as well as public money to improve the coastline and protect businesses and homes.
An interesting point that Duncan Baker made there, I think you saw it in Norfolk and we certainly saw it in the Isle of Wight, is that sea level rise possibly isn't the only climate change impact that's having an effect. He mentioned how wet it's been in February. We think in many parts of the country, February was the wettest it's ever been in quite a few places. And this is relevant because it makes the ground waterlogged and it makes it more likely that cliffs and dunes and mud banks or whatever are more likely to subside, are more likely to disappear. And heavier and longer durations of rainfall, big blocky weather, if you know what I mean, seems to be one of the symptoms of climate change.
Well, thanks very much, Gemma. I'm glad you had a good time in East Anglia. Now, to answer those concerns that we heard both in North Norfolk and in the Isle of Wight, I caught up with the Floods Minister, Robbie Moore, and put to him that some coastal dwellers feel abandoned.
We recognise that we need to increase the level of funding that we're putting in, not only for flooding, but also coastal erosion. So over the next 6-year funding programme, we're increasing that nationally from 2.6 billion to 5.2 billion, with specifically more money being allocated to Norfolk.
Tough decisions have to be made. Currently, they're largely based on the value of what's being protected. Sensible in one way, but you could end up saying, well, poor people's homes don't matter then because they're not worth enough to protect. Isn't that a problem?
We will always look at applications that come in via the local authority, working with various stakeholders on a case-by-case basis to better protect as many homes and businesses as possible. We all know that dealing with coastal erosion is incredibly complex and is a natural process that constantly happens, and not all areas of the coastline can be as better protected as we would hope.
Do you know how much land we've lost in the last 5 or 10 years to the sea?
These things are being monitored by local authorities and stakeholders. Loss figures will be taken into account when we're looking at better protecting homes, but that's not a figure that I have right now.
Are you happy that Britain has got smaller and is getting smaller faster under your administration?
No government has control over the weather, but what we can have control over is what mitigation measures we're putting in place to better protect as many homes as possible.
Robbie Moore, thank you very much indeed.
I accept that this is tricky territory for government. We can't, as we've heard before, put a seawall round the whole of the UK. But in the end, if we pay more, we can protect more. And I think we'll see this issue of disappearing Britain coming up the political spectrum as more and more people become affected by it. It is a really tough conversation to acknowledge that some places might have to go, and possibly even tougher to work out how you make the calculation about what deserves to be protected. That's it for this week's episode, which was produced by Annie Joyce and Gemma Watson. If you fancy listening to another, why not scroll back in our feed for other episodes, such as how disused coal mines could be part of our green energy future, or why the future farmland could be solar farmland. And there's plenty of others if you prefer. Bye.